Father, would you give these brothers wisdom and clarity of mind as they share? In Jesus' name, amen. There you go, brother.
Thank you, Amos. Sorry, go for it. How many of you have fathers who seem to often put your family in somewhat of an awkward position? We grew up, we sang together quite a bit, and Dad was not afraid to get up and have us sing in front of a church as a family. And we as kids did not like that. We felt embarrassed, felt awkward. How many of you can resonate with that? You had a father who would do stuff like that? Kind of? Okay. How many of you have relished the thought of putting your father in an awkward position? So we were told there's 3 sessions and we each get one, and then there's one where we can share. We can either split it or talk together, and trying to figure out how that works. How do we do this? I knew if I let Dad go first, he'd have the whole session. And the same is probably true if I went first. So how's this going to work? And then I just thought, we were talking, actually it was just in the last week, I think. Dad was at our house, and something I wanted to do for a while is start a podcast, even more than a blog, have a podcast and have people on and interview them and talk about it. And so I said, well, maybe this should be my first podcast, and interview Dad. And Dad really resonated with the idea. He was like, oh yeah, that would be good. And then he wondered if I would send him the questions that I'm going to ask him. And I've never done a podcast before, but I've listened to people who have done podcasts before, and you can always tell a difference between the ones where the questions were given out ahead of time and the ones where it was just you got the question right there. It's not scripted, it's more conversational. And so my answer to Dad was, no, I'd like it to be conversational, to be, as if we're sitting at our dinner table talking. But really inside, I just wanted to get him up here to be a little awkward and embarrassed. Actually, that's not true. I just thought about it as we were praying. So the title is Living with Purpose, Purity, and Power. And I think, Dad, you had given that title for it. Why did you give that title?
Because Amos was really getting insistent that we come up with some titles. So I finally put down some titles. I think probably it was a little deeper than that. Power, purpose, and purity. Is that what we ended up with? Or purity?
I think it's purpose, purity, and power.
Purpose, purity, and power. Yeah, that probably is the right order. But
it is.
Thank you. Yeah, just if we understand what sexual sin is and what it isn't, if we understand the root of where our addictions come from, I think we can begin to operate with a sense of new purpose, and out of that purpose is going to be a new sense of purity, because no longer do we need the other stuff. And what's the third word? Power, yeah. Begin to live a life, power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the title too, because it touches on how our sex drive and our sexuality is used for more than just sex. There's the whole concept of power, and the power of the male sexuality is not just that we have a really strong need for sex, but that drive can be used in other ways. And we'll get into this a little bit further, but Also, I like the title because when I was writing my book, I would talk with a lot of different men, talk with older men, talk with you. I was over in Thailand at the time working with IGO, and so there's a lot of older men there who have lived a lot longer than me, living in victory. And so I was always curious what their keys to victory would be like. And I often thought that maybe they would say, never be in the same room with another woman, or be sure and have good accountability. And never once, out of 5 men specifically that I talked with about that, never once did they bring stuff like that up. I had to bring those up to see if, but they would talk about 2 things. One is the living for something bigger than ourselves and just being involved in kind of the power aspect of it. And then the third thing was talking about the fear of God that we'll get into a little bit too. You mentioned it briefly last night, the whole thing of ties in signing your name to a blank sheet of paper, having made the commitment, or just being very aware that your life is not your own. That's what the fear of God is, realizing that God is constantly present. And so, yeah, I enjoyed the title. I think we're going to go in this order. We're going to talk about power and then purpose and how that leads to a life of purity. And just to get us started, and I'm going to read a few quotes. There's a guy, Napoleon Hill, who wrote a book, Think and Grow Rich. It's entirely secular. He's not trying to help you grow in your walk with Christ, but he talks about sexual transmutation. And I've done a little bit of research trying to figure out, like, what do people talk about sexual transmutation today? Because he wrote back in the early 1900s. And pretty much anything psychologists, whenever they're talking about sexual transmutation, they refer back to Napoleon Hill. And basically what sexual transmutation is the energies for sexual desires, the concept that they can be transmuted into another form of energy, not just sex. And one thing Napoleon Hill writes is that sex desire is the most powerful of human desires. When driven by this desire, men develop keenness of imagination, courage, willpower, persistence, and creative ability unknown to them at other times. So strong and impelling is the desire for sexual contact that men freely run the risk of life and reputation to indulge in it. But when harnessed and redirected along other lines, this motivating force maintains all of its attributes of keenness of imagination, courage, etc., which may be used as powerful creative forces in literature, art, or in another profession. The desire cannot and should not be submerged or eliminated, but it should be given an outlet through forms of expression which enrich the body, mind, and spirit of a man. If not given this form of outlet, it will seek outlets through purely physical channels. I remember reading that quote. I was maybe 19 or 20 years old. I'm 28 now, so it's like 9 or 8 years ago. And that was the first time that I had ever heard that my sex desire, my sex drive, could be tied to other areas of my life. And beyond just, like, I had heard some talk about when you're feeling strong urges, go take a jog or something, go wear it off kind of thing. But seeing it as touching areas even beyond just running or beyond just expressing myself sexually, but that it impacts my whole life, like whether I run the risk of starting a ministry or a business. I mean, any of those things are aspects of, kind of ties into your concept of conquest last night. And we as men are made to conquest, to be initiators, to go out. Even tenderness at times can feel risky. And so being tender with children. And that's all using our sexual energies. can be a way of using our sexual energies. And it's not coincidence that when we're just sitting around playing computer games or watching sports, we're going to struggle with sexual temptations a lot more. Versus when I think a lot about writing the book. You know, I was teaching school when I started writing the book, and so I would get up early to write and then go teach school and then come back and maybe have time to do some more writing, or also raising a family at that time. And all of that was meaningful to me. I would sacrifice sleep or time, and it was deeply meaningful to me. And just being involved in something meaningful, especially as I started leaking it out and people were being positively affected by it, it became even more meaningful. And I found myself not being as tempted, not feeling as pulled to sexual things. And then we moved back to the States, and the book is pretty much finished. And I'm finding my place. What is my role? And I feel lost, and I feel like I'm not sure what I'm here doing. And I found the temptations rise. And so just that concept that sex desire can be transmuted into other areas of our lives. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, how you have seen that, if you have seen that in your life, and then even specifically since Mom's death, or as a single man, like how might that help when you're feeling strong sexual urges?
Yeah, no, it's very helpful, I think, and very true. I wouldn't have known the terms, what do you call it?
Transmutation.
Transmutation. But it certainly is true. And I'm sure anyone here that's walking in victory knows that to be true as well, that when you are living with purpose and just have a big vision, a big, just lots that you want to do in life and lots that you want to get done, and you love people and you love to interact with people and all of those things. I'm just speaking more out of my own experience. That's kind of what I thrive in. When I am thriving in that sense of purpose, it's just like the sexual temptation, almost the sexual drive is not even there. And it's not that I don't feel attracted or even that I don't feel attractive. I think I still feel attractive as a person, and I still am attracted to beautiful ladies. I think in a proper way, or for me, and kind of mixing it all together, it's one of the things that I have missed the most from marriage and from Rachel was, well, first of all, just who she was as a person. She was a friend and a person, and she's not here anymore. But long before I began to even miss the sex was just missing the feminine presence, just her femininity. And I think I talked last night about her slender fingers and delicate touch, and that was, So, and it's not that like, when I take Pastor Jose out for coffee, I often ask him to please bring Sister Anna with him. And part of that is that I like women. I like the presence, I like the effect of women in my life. And so I don't just want Jose, but I want his wife there. Because sometimes they have a perspective that us guys don't ever get to, or, do you get what I'm saying? Does that make sense? So yeah, I obviously missed that. And then the sexual, and I don't know when you want me to go here in the conversation and talk about letter I got from the guy in Minnesota. But yeah, I missed that long before I ever began to think about missing sex.
Yeah, go for it if you want to.
Okay. So I think Rachel was gone for, I'm gonna guess 6 months maybe, or something like that. And I'm in the throes of grief. And each month is you grow and you heal as you go, but 6 months is not very far into loss, especially of a spouse. And I'm just really still missing her. And one of the worst times of the day was for me to come home from somewhere, whether I was traveling or from work, because she wouldn't be there. And so I got to the place where I didn't even want to leave the house, because I knew eventually I'd have to come back. And so I'd just rather be there and just stay there. But somewhere in there, 6 months or so, I got this letter from a friend in Minnesota, which is where we used to live, a guy, a man just slightly younger than myself. And he was wanting, I think, to care for me and encourage me and whatever. But so he said, wow, he said, what must it be like to, have been sexually active for 28 years and suddenly have no spouse, and it was kind of like, oh, that's right. It's been a while since I've had sex. It was kind of like, I almost felt violated. I almost felt, just violated by suddenly somebody stuffing sex under my nose, and because it really wasn't a big deal to me at that point. It just wasn't that big of a deal, and it was just like, so. And then, I was kind of rudely brought back into the real life of singlehood, and I have sexual drives, and I can feel tempted, and so and I even I think had what at least I would describe as a sense of failure, and the wrong images catching my attention and things like that.
So this kind of ties in, we've talked different times throughout the last few sessions about how our sexuality, what we go to sex for things, not necessarily for the sex even, but there's things beyond that. Like, do you think our attraction to women is, what I hear you saying is that it's much more than just the sexual, wanting sexual.
Mm-hmm.
Do we ever get attracted just for sex?
Well, I wouldn't mind throwing the question out here. How many of you that are married, or I could even say, how many of you that want to be married, how many of you that are married got married for the sex?
You're asking them to raise hands?
Yes, and I don't think any of you are liars, so please raise your hand if you got married for sex. No, you don't have to. You don't have to answer that question if you don't want. If you want to, go ahead.
I think it was included.
It was included, yeah. So you probably wouldn't have married somebody.
If you're not wanting to have sex with them, you probably wouldn't marry them, right?
Yeah, that's what he's just said. Yeah, and that's interesting. I think it's okay. I've been amazed at some marriages that I've seen. How many of you know? Well, yeah. Anyways, there are some people. Yeah, I would love to believe that, like, as I think back to when Mom and I got married, I'm sure it was probably a given. You know, it was just kind of a given. But I certainly didn't get married for the sex.
Is there a fine line between, like, so for Teresa and I when I started noticing her and liking her, I wasn't thinking about sex. But by the time we actually got married, I was very much looking forward to having sex with her.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're trying to point out the original attraction of.
Yeah. I believe sex is even different. Sometimes people equate it to food, our appetite for food. It's not the same. You don't need sex to stay alive. But you need food to stay alive. Okay? Sex is more like ice cream. You know, you can live without ice cream, right?
But you gotta have kids.
Well, that is a command. So I guess if you feel commanded to have sex, I guess that's... yeah. No, I don't want to diminish that because it is a part of the package, and it's beautiful, and it's nothing wrong with loving and appreciating and desiring sex. But I would hope that our wives feel loved for more than just their bodies, you know, their spirit, their personality, who they are, and
And I think I'm trying to figure out which way to take this conversation, because there's this taps into, I can't remember if you said anything up on stage or if it was more talking with the team and stuff, but there's a bit of an idolization of sex in our culture, which splashes off into the church. And with that is an idolization of marriage, too. And this, I think I've heard you say that if marriage is the answer to our sexual problems, but for every other problem, Jesus is the answer to it. There's this kind of dance almost, because sex is very much a part of the intimacy. Adam and Eve, God very much created Adam and Eve for intimacy with him. And the one flesh, the oneness together is a part of that. Where have we perhaps idolized sex? Where have we idolized marriage? And how does that affect our struggles with sexual sin?
well, our culture idolizes sex. I think we as Christians in conservative churches at least, don't believe we idolize sex. But we kind of piggyback on that idolization by highlighting marriage, giving marriage a wrong emphasis. Now, I believe in marriage. Anybody that's been around me knows that. I teach on marriage. I love teaching on marriage. So I'm not diminishing marriage, but I am saying that I believe we as a Christian, conservative Christian community have simply used marriage. That's our expression of idolizing sex. And so we say, yeah, you got a problem with drugs, you got a problem with alcohol, you got a problem with anything else. We offer Jesus as the solution, but when it comes to sexual issues, it's you just really need a good wife. You need a good marriage. That will solve your problem. And that's idolizing marriage. It's really doing the same thing. It's just saying, here's the way to have sex. We can't live without sex. So anybody knows it. I mean, it's amazing. You talk to secular people and perhaps even Christian people. Maybe it's different in Indiana, but in California, it's just like, oh yeah, it's a given. everybody has to have sex. I mean, you gotta, it's a right, you know. And so, you know, let me go back to the food analogy. You don't need ice cream. You can live without ice cream. I've done a fair amount of fasting in my lifetime. I've done 6 or 8 40-day fasts. Never been able to do just total water fasts. And fasting can become just another works religion. So, you know, please understand that. But I don't fast for those purposes. But I really wanted to do a long water fast, and twice, 8 days into it, I ended up in the emergency room. So I finally concluded that if I'm going to fast, if I'm going to practice fasting, I have to drink some juices while I'm fasting. I often do a few days with water and then go to juices, whatever. So one fast I did, and this was years ago when we still lived in Minnesota, I went on a dessert fast. So I went for a whole year without eating any dessert. And probably ate a little extra mashed potatoes or something, you know. But I found out that I don't need desserts to live. In fact, I don't even need desserts to be happy. I can enjoy life very well without cookies and cake and ice cream. And at the end of that year, I often wondered, why did I ever go back to eating this junk? You know. So, in the same way, we can live without sex. I don't need sex to stay alive. But I do need purpose. And so in the early days of my singlehood again, widowerhood, whatever you call it, I soon got to writing. Well, I was 6 months, and then suddenly I'm rudely awakened, and oh yeah, that's right, you're a sexual being, but I was writing my book then, and so that really gave me purpose, and it probably elongated my grieving process. I probably ended up grieving longer because I was wading through all kinds of stuff that she had written and talking to her parents about her and so forth. But that was early on, the early days of that kept me occupied. And once the book was written, then I began to do a lot of teaching, just like I sent books ahead of me to this event. Anytime I go to a church or something, I usually send some books ahead of me. And I do a lot of the teaching. If you want to know what I believe, read my book. That's it's a little shorter than reading the Bible, but so that's the only reason I say that. Read the Bible. If you want to know what I believe, read the Bible. But anyway, so I do a lot of teaching out of that, and that keeps me active and busy. But I'm still tempted. You know. Yeah, I don't want to ramble. Let's give you a chance here to jump in.
Yeah, so is the solution to sexual problems purpose?
I think so.
An area of this conversation that I think that it somehow we've got to foster in our churches to begin having these conversations is how our sexuality is for much more than just sexual expression, because we have people in our churches who cannot express themselves sexually. They're single. They desperately want to get married, or maybe they're okay being single. But our church, I don't understand all the history of it yet, but somehow there has become this just embedded in culture that, you got to be married to be a leader in the church, or the voice of married men, even though they're young and immature, carries a bit of weight more than someone who's older and mature, but he's single. I've noticed that as a young married man, that what I said what carried more weight, and there was a guy almost 10 years older than me sitting in the same room. And so we're sending these mixed signals that to have purpose, to have value in our congregations, you got to be married first. There's also another element that we haven't discussed at all this weekend, and it's really because it's not a part of my story, it's not a part of Dad's story, but that's the whole, when someone struggles with attraction to someone of their own sex and their own gender, and not, I mean, you want to talk about a subject you can't talk about. That's one. And unpacking everything that goes into that. And if sex or if marriage is the solution to sexual problems, and if marriage really is what Genesis tells us, two separate sexual beings coming together in one flesh, then that person, we are asking that person to never have sexual fulfillment. And somehow we've got to see I believe God gave each of us as men a purpose for our sexuality that is much more than just expressing ourselves sexually. And I think of, just to read another quote, some of you may have seen or read Bruce Langman's book, To Kill a Lion. He talks about passivity versus power. The passive male is like an 8-cylinder car that runs on just 5 cylinders. He's the man who doesn't lead his family spiritually, doesn't pursue his dreams, doesn't fight for right, he does sweep problems under the rug. He's content to survive, but not challenged to thrive. His life is often a quest to enjoy life instead of living to make a difference in the world or in his family. Male passiveness is a cultural poison and an epidemic plague, and has everything to do with the sexual climate in our society. Passiveness is so subtle that most men don't see it or understand it, but it could be the festering ground behind their sexual dependence. And just as there are deeper things like our connection with the Father that in our identity, where we're drawing our identity, that affect what we do with our sexuality and what we're going to, in the same way, whether we're living for something bigger than ourselves, whether we're discovering our purpose, plays a huge role in our ability to see what I as a man am made for. And so what does that look like? How do we, because I think most of us slip into passivity when we don't see purpose for our lives. And when we see that purpose clearly, then we typically, I think, most men engage and we become more active. How do you find purpose?
I would go back and maybe slightly correct what you just said, that we slip into passivity when we don't have purpose. We also slip into passivity when we're opposed. Or that's one thing we can do. Some men will stand up and fight and destroy their marriage in opposition when they're opposed. But that's also what forces some men into passivity, is rather than fight, they don't want to hurt. They don't want to hurt this woman that they love, and yeah, if she's their toy or the satisfaction of their lust, they don't want to hurt her, and so they just move into this passivity. And anyway, what was the question again?
How do we find purpose to know what is our purpose?
Well, I just think it has to do with what's before you, what's in front of you, what needs done in your life, what needs done around you. For me, that's what it is anyways, and not that I necessarily try to do it all myself, but I try to, as an overseer and as a visionary sort of person. I try to figure how can we get this problem solved. Like in Los Angeles, we have homeless people. We got all kinds of homeless people. What are we doing about this? We have gangs. What's being done? Maybe there's maybe Jose having little Jose, not Pastor Jose, having grown up in the culture of gangs and violence, maybe, and he just recently is asked to be baptized. So, this is exciting, see, he's going to be baptized, and maybe God can use him. So I begin to imagine, I'm not actually doing all the work, but I'm doing a lot of the imagination and trying to fan the flame. And so that, to me, that's what makes me come alive, is just recognizing needs around me and what can we do to solve it. And I reckon you have some needs around you. Maybe your mission field is primarily Old Order Amish. I don't know. Maybe it's just plain old English people.
So what is I played baseball. I played high school baseball for 8 years growing up. Is baseball a purpose? Are computer games a purpose? That's in front of me.
Boy, I have a big question about computer games, but I can see purpose in baseball because it involves people.
So I guess my question is, what constitutes a purpose? What makes up?
Okay, so there again, you want to look at God. What means something to God? God created people, and people are God's passion, and so that should be my passion. So we should be passionate about people, and I realize giftings are different. Maybe you're just this quiet person that would rather sit in an office and do data entry or something like that. If that's who you are and you're using it to serve somewhere down the chain people, then I think you can lead meaningful lives doing that. But God has a huge heart for people, and so should you. So should anybody who claims to love God and have a desire to serve him. So that's why I say baseball can have purpose, because it involves people. And if you can even coach a baseball team, that's even better. But in order to coach, you have to know something about the game. So you're going to probably have to play for a while. Sam, one of our teammates, Sam Kurtz, has coached. He isn't right now, but when their son was in little league age, he actually coached one of our local, not a real professional team, but just one of our local little league baseball teams. And it involved people. They're amazing how many parents they learn to know in that process of baseball.
Yeah, so people is a piece, something that has to do with people is a part of it. Is there, do I have one purpose that God has designed? Does each person have one purpose that they've got to somehow discover, or what is the nature of purpose?
Yeah, I think God primarily gives people in a strong area, but there may be multiple purposes. I think a lot of it revolves around people, which revolves around God. You need to love God. You need to love worship. If you're not loving worship, something's wrong. And I'm not saying you have to raise your hands and dance with the music, but you have to want to see God lifted up and exalted, and that's a part of any Christian that's made alive in Christ. Even if you can't carry a tune in a basket, you ought to be just loving God and loving to see his name exalted. And so worship people, helping people. That's where much of it's going to revolve. And there's so many different avenues you could go down to from there. I mean, a mechanic working in the job, fixing cars, is serving people, and even I think I've wondered at times if you can build luxury homes and still be a Christian. I think you can. I'm trying to strike where it hurts here in northern Indiana, or maybe it's motorhomes, fancy motorhomes. I think you can still minister to people. You know, we find it. The conservative Anabaptists find it easy to minister to the down and outers, a little more challenging to minister to the up and outers. So you can minister to the up and outers by building luxury homes, I suppose.
I like how you keep coming back to God, what's important on God's heart. I have not journeyed. I was young when I got married, so I haven't journeyed through singlehood with sexual desires. I've not journeyed feeling same-sex attraction or anything, but the more I hear from people who have had those journeys, a theme that I hear coming through, especially people who are journeying well, is that like we usurp God so quickly, and our purpose becomes, like even making disciples can become a purpose. And I'm not sure that's actually what Scripture says. Our purpose is to be one with God and to know God. And sometimes it calls us to die to ourselves. Actually, it always calls us to die to ourselves. But there's areas of our lives where we have to sacrifice. And we're so quick to do that when it comes to sports or some entertainment. Like, you need to die to yourself. You need to be willing to let that go. There's an element where anything, even something good, if it's not being used within God's design, then we have to sacrifice that. We have to die to ourselves in it. And so the purpose is knowing God, being one with God, like you were pointing out. And from that may mean I sacrifice sexual expression. I know there are some in this room that, like, there's probably sharp pain inside of you when you hear that. And I feel a similar pain because I can't imagine not having that. And we live in a time when the church we can't fathom calling people to that, saying, oh, you can't express yourself sexually. So we'll adjust what God's design is so that it can encompass that. And the problem is, those of us that stand no marriages between man and woman for life, we're not offering solutions to the problems that churches who are saying you can have same-sex marriages are solving. And so we need community. We need encouragement among each other to press on in that oneness with God. We need to nurture ways that men and women can express their sexuality in ways far beyond just sexual expression. We need to model dying to ourselves in other areas of life. Part of that might even be sex for ourselves. Sometimes we have this, hands off until marriage, and then it's all hands on. And we're not dealing with the fact that sex is designed to be something I give to my wife. It's not something I'm designed to demand of my wife. And Paul talks about giving to each other your conjugal rights in 1 Corinthians 7, I think it is. And that's not me as a husband tell my wife, you're supposed to give me my conjugal rights, but something I'm offering to her. And there may be times when I have to go without. And I think what you're trying to get at is, can we do that? or has sexual expression become an idol in our lives? Does fulfilling our sexual desires, is that more important to us than becoming one with God? And I think our purpose comes out of that oneness with God and knowing God. There's a lot more we can talk. I think we're supposed to be wrapping it up here soon. Did you have anything more to share?
Just this thought went flitting through my mind. I think it was of the Lord. As you were talking, if you're having sex with your wife and she is not enjoying it, she's not happy, you're not having sex. You're just being a monster. So if she's not enjoying it, you got other places you need to go. You got other things you need to be doing other than having sex. You need to start communicating with her. You need to figure out, what is it that makes your wife happy? What makes your wife come alive? And whatever makes her happy is where you need to be going. And you say, well, what if she wants a new Mercedes every year? You married her, right? No, but there's a conversation that needs to start. What makes your wife come alive? And when she's alive, you'll start having sex, real sex. It takes two live people to have real sex.
Yeah, just as we wrap stuff up, I'm just curious, the area of purity and walking in purity as we go forth from here, what does that look like? Does accountability play a role in it? How does...
This is one other thing I wanted to say, and I think it comes in here. For me, sexual temptation happens in mid-afternoon, not in the morning. I am the most alive and on fire for God in the morning when my alarm clock rings at 4:30 and I need to go jump in my truck and run down and put more books on those book displays in the Walmarts. I work for Choice Books. And I'm praising the Lord as I'm driving down the highway, and I'm just imagining all that he wants me to do today. It's when I'm coming back. I got up at 4, and I'm coming back mid-afternoon, and I'm stuck in traffic and trying desperately to stay awake, and that's when I get tempted sexually. And but I need to be aware of that. And so that helps me figure out, what am I going to do? Do I have, music along or tapes along or something that I can listen to keep me preoccupied? Or is there something, maybe I should be using this time to do something down in Orange County before trying to get home, and then when I do come home, I can just sail through. And so I need to strategically approach my temptation. What I have learned to know is my temptation. And I think all of us probably have those areas if we're self-aware.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed that if there's a few times I've traveled by myself, gone someplace and I was staying by myself, and it's interesting. I'm trying to think if I traveled much before getting married by myself. But I've noticed, I've done it 3 times where I was away from my family for about a week, and I have yet to do that where I did not face incredible moral temptation. And the first couple times I didn't even think about it, and it caused a real struggle. But realizing that now and knowing that ahead of time, or busy seasons of life where you're just tired and you're like, is that kind of what you're talking about? Feel it, seeing those patterns when the things come up.
Yeah, that's it. And and back to the whole thing of the same-sex attraction, orientation, that's kind of along the same line. We talked slightly some about masturbation in my small group. Those are symptomatic. Yeah, those same-sex orientation is not the way God designed. And masturbation is not the way God designed. God designed genitals to come together in mutual satisfaction. That's how he created our bodies. And that's how they're fulfilled. And so, but the bigger issue, like I meet every Thursday evening with a man that we baptized last spring who chose to follow Jesus and is just passionately following the Lord. I would have declared even at the time of when we baptized him, we chose to baptize. And I realize this is a can of worms and maybe I shouldn't be going there. Maybe you have different positions on baptized. We believe baptism is very closely tied to salvation. Well, I went over that. It's the church's part, the church's role. And so I've since come to realize that he isn't gay, but he dresses that way, and for some reason kind of has that. He's very refined in his mannerisms and so forth, and so that teaches me to not jump to conclusions and judge people. But my whole goal in meeting with him on a regular basis is to call God out in him, and part of God in him is his masculinity. God has designed him as a man. And I've said to him, you would make an excellent father. He's the activities director in a nursing home, and he creates all kinds of fun activities for not only for the residents but for the staff. He has just a way. I said I would have been a better father if I could have been more excited about making fun things happen in our family and stuff. And so I'm calling out his masculinity, and I'm not, even though I didn't know it at the time that he wasn't gay, I wasn't shaking my finger in his nose saying, you better not be same-sex oriented,
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. I think we're about out of time. Just to touch on accountability a little bit, I think that word has a lot of baggage with it, maybe. I picked that up some. I think a lot of people have kind of this feeling like I need to be accountable. I think a better word might be connection. I think that's the same thing. That's what we're trying to communicate with accountability, but being in connection with other brothers, other people. And the power of it is when we're giving it to others versus taking it from someone else or expecting other people to come take it from us. But like when I have chosen I'm going to give account of how I'm doing what I'm doing, and when I'm doing it with brothers that I connect with on a regular basis, that is a powerful tool in walking in continual purity, because a huge need that we as humans have is connection with each other. We need this connection with God. We also need connection with each other. And I think
Amen.
that's where we'll end it. Amos, we'll turn it over to you.